One of the most controversial and politically charged issues in Asia right now, especially relating to China, is that of Tibet, and it has historically been one of the most politically charged and controversial issues. So in this video, what I'm going to do is discuss this idea of independent Tibet, as well as discussing some of what I find are the more prevalent myths and misconceptions regarding this, and providing some historical context to where Tibet is right now. So to start with the history, Tibet has been a part of China since the 1700s. That's when it was formally incorporated into China. At that time, China was ruled by the Qing dynasty. In 1911, the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, Puyi, abdicated to the Republic of China, which was viewed by both parties as well as all world governments as the legitimate successor state of China, which means that it took over all of China's holdings. In the following year, in 1912, the 13th Dalai Lama declared independence of China. This was the claim at that time not recognized by the Republic of China, nor was it recognized by any world powers. It did experience de facto independence, however, at that time for the next few decades, which was not out of character for China at that time, because the Republic of China at that point had a very weak central government, and in fact, a lot of provinces and parts of the country operated under what is de facto independency. However, at no point was there de jure independency, and at no point was there internationally recognized or domestically recognized de jure independency. So, and just as a side note, because one of the, I think, most greatest misconceptions about Tibet is that it was a kind of peaceful independent nation until China invaded it. The only military conflict to occur between China and Tibet from 1912 all the way to the 50s is that in 1930, the 13th Dalai Lama, who I guess you could call a very ambitious man, invaded the Qinghai province in China. In 1932, he was repelled again, but this was a large-scale invasion, and that was the only way it flowed. So in the 1950s, the Civil War had ended, and the Communists emerged victorious in 1949, sorry. And at this point, the leadership in Tibet, which is a collection of basically priests, because it was a theocracy, which means basically the religion is officially in charge of the state and every aspect of it. A collection of priests, nobility, and the nobility who owned land, negotiated with the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party upon what to do with Tibet. And they came to an agreement known as the 17-point agreement. This basically reaffirmed Chinese sovereignty over Tibet, which, as I said, there was no grounds for independent Tibet at any point. And also, it was an agreement that Tibet would carry out autonomously the land reforms that were being carried out by the communists in the rest of China, land and social reforms. In the 50s, the communists carried out large-scale reforms in terms of land reforms, abolishing serfdom, which is a big point because China at that point was a feudal society, and a large part of the population were serfs, which is a very kind of backwards and barbaric practice. That's virtually slaves. Basically, your choice is to be a slave or starve, so you have the freedom to starve as a serf. Other policies included universal education, secular education as opposed to religious education. So these were all reforms that were being carried on in China at that time that Tibet implicitly agreed in the 17-point agreements it would carry on autonomously. In the 50s, there was a feeling within the Chinese Communist Party that Tibet wasn't carrying out these reforms fast enough. And probably I will, because I'm not a biased shield for the Chinese Communist Party, I will admit that there was probably a motive as well just to finally re-exert central control over Tibet. So at this point, the Chinese army occupied Tibet and began to implement the land reforms, etc., etc. And this was when the 14th Dalai Lama, who at that time was a child, fled and then began the Tibetan Independence Movement and formed the exile government in India at that time. So the entire so-called invasion of Tibet, as far as I'm concerned, and it's discussable the morality of it, but the entire invasion of Tibet was an event internal to the Chinese Revolution and internal to the Chinese Civil War, and is recognized by every single world government as being such. And the idea that there was an independent Tibet prior to the kind of communist invasion, I don't think has a leg to stand on. So next we're going to go through some of the more prevalent myths about current Tibet. Actually, let me just briefly characterize the Tibetan Independence Movement. So the Tibetan Independence Movement, which was formed in India, still largely based in India, but it's all around the world obviously, is very characteristic of a Cold War era white immigrant movement, by which I mean it's overwhelmingly upper class and overwhelmingly conservative, and also it was pretty substantially backed by the CIA, to a degree Britain, etc., as a point of agitation against Eastern Bloc countries. So my point is, don't ever be so naive about independence movements. I believe Jean-Luc Mélenchon from France once said, also of Tibet, but he was vaguely talking about Kosovo. He's saying, don't be so naive about this. Kosovo said that it didn't want independence and that it was an independent movement, etc., etc. And then before long, we know there's now a US airbase within Kosovo. So this is definitely, and for any leftists supporting Tibetan independence, I want you all to kind of think about, very carefully think about the motives here and the forces at play here, and how easily this movement can be subverted for what could be described as fairly destructive geopolitical goals. In fact, in the 50s and in the 60s as well, the CIA dropped commandos, which were basically Tibetan exiled nobles trained by the CIA, into China to try to instigate an uprising. And even by their own reports, they reported that the Tibetan populace at that time seemed unwilling to join the insurgency attempt. Certainly, I think now it may be a different story, and that's not because the nature of the independence movement has changed. It's just because a native population tends to understandably resent being ruled from another place, even if that other place began ruling it with the best of intentions. And obviously now it's no longer the best of intentions. Now it's just there's some pretty shocking infringements on human rights, although not to the degree characterized by the Tibetan Independence Movement, and I'll go into that now.